The warning left my lips before I could stop it. That was always my problem. I thought too fast and spoke even faster. And in a place like this, that combination had already cost me more than I cared to count. But standing in the gray pre-dawn light of the castle courtyard, watching two men load the royal carriage with what looked like far too little luggage for a 5-day journey, something locked into place inside my chest. A coldness, a certainty. I had not slept well. The straw in the servants' quarters had been damp again, and I'd spent most of the night listening to the wind drag itself against the stone walls like something trying to claw its way inside. Around the 3rd hour, when the castle was as quiet as it ever got, I had risen and gone to refill the oil lamp at the end of the hall. That was when I saw them. 2 figures moving through the lower corridor with the particular kind of quietness that isn't accidental. One of them carried a length of rope. The other carried something wrapped in cloth, something heavy enough to shift the balance of his walk. I had pressed myself into the shadow behind the water basin and waited until they passed. I did not follow them. I was not that kind of person. Not brave in the drawn sword, chest-forward way that the song celebrated. I was brave in smaller, quieter ways that nobody ever wrote about. I noticed things. I remembered things. And in the hours that followed, lying sleepless on my cot, I pieced together what I had seen with everything else I'd been quietly accumulating over the past 3 weeks. The loose spoke on the carriage's rear left wheel, which had not been replaced despite my report to the stablemaster. The new coachman, Aldrich, who had arrived only 9 days ago with impeccable references from a northern province that, when I'd thought about it carefully, should have taken at least 3 weeks to travel from. The way the head steward had avoided my eyes at dinner for 4 nights in a row. And now the rope, and the wrapped, weighted thing. By the time the courtyard began filling with the slow movements of morning preparation, I had made my decision. Which was how I found myself standing 3 feet from the King of Varenmoor, Cassian Drell, at an hour when no maid had any business being anywhere near him. He was taller than I remembered from the few times I had seen him at distance, though that was not difficult, since I was not tall myself. Pale blonde hair tucked behind my ears, a second-hand cloak that had once been someone else's gray, and was now something closer to the color of old ash. I had not thought about what I looked like when I'd crossed the courtyard. I had only thought about the rope. "Your Majesty," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I deserved. He turned. The morning had not fully committed to itself yet. The sky was that particular shade between charcoal and lilac. And in that uncertain light, Cassian Drell looked less like the figure of authority I had constructed in my imagination, and more like a man who had also not slept well. There were shadows beneath his eyes. His jaw was set in the way that men set their jaws when they are already tired of a day that has barely started. He looked at me the way all-powerful men look at servants who interrupt them, with the flat, measured patience of someone deciding how much time they can afford to spend being annoyed. "You're one of the chambermaids," he said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like a categorization. "Emma," I said, because I had learned that nameless people are much easier to dismiss. "I work the East Wing, Your Majesty, and I need you to hear something before you step into that carriage." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite interest, but not the dismissal I'd been bracing for either. He was silent for a beat. Around us, stable hands moved with the focused indifference of people paid not to hear things. "The carriage is a trap," I said. The words landed in the quiet courtyard like a stone dropped into still water. I watched them ripple across his face, the brief flicker of something sharp behind those dark eyes, there and then carefully contained. "That is a significant claim," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "Yes," I said. "It is." I told him quickly, in the compressed and urgent way of someone who knows they may be interrupted at any moment. The loose spoke. Aldrich's impossible travel time, the figures in the corridor, the rope and the weighted cloth. I watched his face as I spoke, and I did not embellish. and I did not minimize, and when I was done, I clasped my hands in front of me and waited. He studied me for a long moment. I had the unsettling impression that he was not only listening to what I had said, but also reading something in the way I was standing, the way I held my breath, the particular quality of my stillness. Then he looked past me, at the carriage. The morning light had strengthened slightly, enough to catch the brass fittings on the doors, the freshly polished wood of the frame. It was, on its surface, a perfectly ordinary royal conveyance prepared for a perfectly ordinary diplomatic journey to the border province of Elnath. "How long have you been watching?" he asked. 3 weeks, I said, "since Aldrich arrived." Another silence. In the distance, a horse shifted in its stall, and the sound of its hooves against the stable floor was very loud in the space between us. "And you came to me," he said slowly, "instead of the steward, or the captain of the guard." I had prepared for this question too. "The steward has not looked me in the eye in 4 days," I said, "and the captain received a private letter from the northern province 3 days before Aldrich arrived. I delivered it myself." Whatever he had been deciding in the long quiet of those moments, something in him settled then. Not visibly. He didn't move, didn't change his posture, didn't give anything away to anyone watching from a distance. But I felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. "Go back to the East Wing," he said. "Do not speak of this to anyone. Do not change your routine." He turned then, as if the conversation had ended, and raised his hand to signal the coachman, but not to board. A different gesture, one I didn't recognize. But Aldrich, I noticed, went very still when he saw it. I turned to walk back toward the servants' entrance, my heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. I had taken perhaps 7 steps when I heard Cassian Drell's voice behind me, low and carrying in the still morning air. "Emma." I stopped, did not turn. "You were right to come to me," he said. I walked the rest of the way to the East Wing without looking back, but my hands were shaking by the time I reached the door, and not entirely from fear. The East Wing had a particular smell in the mornings, cold stone and beeswax and the faint ghost of last night's candles. I knew every corner of it the way you know a place you have inhabited for so long that it stops being a place and becomes an extension of yourself. The creak of the 3rd step on the back staircase. The way the light came through the tall window at the end of the corridor, at precisely the angle that made it impossible to see dust until you had already walked through it. The drafts that moved through the walls in winter like whispered conversations between rooms. I had come to Varenmore Castle at 22 3 years ago, with nothing but a canvas bag and a letter of recommendation from the household where I had previously worked. A minor lord's residence in the south, where the primary skill required had been invisibility. Make yourself small. Don't speak unless spoken to. Learn where everything goes and put it back exactly as you found it. I had been very good at invisible. What I had not anticipated was that invisible people see everything. I went through the motions of my morning duties with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been told not to change her routine and understands exactly why that instruction matters. I changed the linen in the 2 guest chambers on the upper floor. I refilled the oil lamps. I carried the ashes from the fireplace in the blue sitting room down to the ash yard and exchanged pleasantries with Nora, who worked the West Wing and had a laugh like a startled bird and a gift for knowing everything that happened in this castle approximately 6 hours before it happened. "You look pale," Nora said, squinting at me over the ash bucket. "I didn't sleep well." Nobody did. Something in the air last night. She tilted her head the way she did when she was about to tell me something she had decided was worth the risk of telling. "Did you hear? The king's journey has been postponed." I kept my expression exactly where it was. "Has it? Aldrich's been dismissed." She lowered her voice, though there was no one within 30 feet of us. "Just like that, this morning. They're saying he misrepresented his credentials." She paused to let that settle. "The whole guard rotation has been changed too. 4 new men on the south gate. Something happened. "I imagine these things happen," I said. Nora looked at me for a moment with the particular expression she wore when she suspected I knew more than I was saying. Then she picked up her bucket and walked back toward the west entrance. And I stood in the ash yard in the thin morning light and breathed in the cold air and tried to stop my hands from shaking again. He had moved quickly. Whatever signal he had sent Aldrich had been the beginning of something larger and faster than I had understood while standing in the courtyard. By the time I had been walking back to the east wing, things had already been set into motion. The journey postponed. The coachman removed. The guard rotation changed. I thought about the rope. I thought about what might have happened on the road to Elnath, in the particular stretch of forest between the 3rd and 4th mile markers, where the trees grew close enough to the road that a carriage could be stopped without any of the riders having room to maneuver. I thought about it once, precisely, and then I locked the thought away, in the place where I kept things I needed to not think about in order to continue functioning. 3 days passed. The castle settled back into its rhythms in the way that institutions always do, absorbing disruption and smoothing it over until the surface was calm again, even if the water underneath was still running fast. A new coachman arrived. A man named Perrin, who had worked the royal stables for 11 years before a back injury had moved him to other duties, and who was therefore known, vouched for, incapable of having arrived from the north in 9 days. I did my work. I changed linens and refilled lamps and carried ashes and helped Nora press the velvet curtains for the East Gallery when the first of the diplomatic visitors began to arrive ahead of the rescheduled journey. I was invisible. I was exactly where I was supposed to be and doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. On the 4th morning, a page found me in the corridor outside the blue sitting room. He was a young man, 16 or 17, with the serious expression of someone who has been given an important task and is determined not to ruin it. He told me, in a voice that was carefully formal, that my presence was requested in the king's study at the 3rd hour of the afternoon. I looked at him for a moment. "By whom?" "By His Majesty," the page said, and had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable about it. I nodded and said I would be there. And then I stood in the corridor for a long moment after the page had gone and had a brief, private conversation with myself about what this meant and what it probably didn't mean and why I should not, under any circumstances, begin constructing narratives around a single event when I had no information. I changed my apron at the 2nd hour. It was the only concession I made. The king's study was on the 3rd floor of the North Tower, and I had been in it exactly once before, to replace a burned-out candle while Cassian Drell was away from the castle. It was a room that surprised you, smaller than you expected, given everything, and more cluttered. Books not arranged for display but actually read, their spines creased, slips of paper marking pages, maps on the secondary table with notes written in the margins, a window that looked north, toward the distant gray suggestion of mountains. He was standing at that window when I arrived. He turned when I knocked on the open door, and for the 2nd time in 4 days, I had the strange experience of seeing him not as the abstracted authority I carried in my head, but as a specific person in a specific room, with morning light on one side of his face and shadow on the other. "Close the door," he said. I did. I stood near it, the way you stand when you want to maintain the option of leaving quickly, which I recognized even as I did it as a habit of someone who had spent a great deal of time in rooms where her presence was provisional. "Sit down, Emma," he said. And there was something slightly different in the way he said my name this time. Not the careful deployment of it that he'd used in the courtyard, the tool for making me stop walking. Something less calculated. I wasn't sure what to do with that, so I set it aside and sat in the chair across from his desk. He sat as well. For a moment, he simply looked at the surface of the desk, where a series of papers were arranged with the deliberateness of someone who has been organizing his thoughts through organizing his space. I owe you an explanation, he said. You don't, I said. He looked up at that. A brief, sharp look, not unfriendly. I think I do. You took a significant risk in speaking to me. You deserve to know what you helped prevent. I held very still and waited. The loose spoke would have failed on the road, he said, in the forest section, between the 3rd and 4th markers. The carriage would have overturned. In the confusion, 2 men positioned along that road were to approach. He paused. The rope and the weighted cloth were not for me. They were to ensure that no one from my escort would be able to report what had happened. The study was very quiet. Outside, faintly, the sound of the castle going about its afternoon. The captain of the guard, I said, was involved, yes, and 2 members of the council. He said it evenly, in the tone of a man who has had time to process his anger into something colder and more useful. A faction that has been unhappy with the Elnath negotiations. They preferred a different outcome to the border question, one that would have required a different king. I thought about what I had seen in the corridor, the 2 figures moving with deliberate quiet. I had not known, that night, what I was seeing. I had only known it was wrong. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, I go to Elnath, with Perrin, and a guard rotation I trust, and a carriage that has been inspected by 3 separate people whose names I know going back 20 years. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. And the council members in question are currently reconsidering the benefits of a comfortable early retirement. I looked at him across the desk and tried to organize what I was feeling into something manageable. There was relief, which made sense. There was the residual trembling of attention that had finally released, which also made sense. What didn't entirely make sense was the particular quality of the quiet between us in that room, which was not the quiet of a king and a chambermaid, but something that didn't have a name I was ready to use yet. I wanted to ask you something, he said. Of course. He rested his hands flat on the desk. It was, I noticed, a gesture that had nothing of the courtly about it, just a man steadying himself before saying something he had thought about carefully. You said you'd been watching for 3 weeks, noticing, piecing things together. He paused. What made you bring it to me instead of simply finding a reason to be ill that day? You could have protected yourself and said nothing. The question landed somewhere undefended in me. I had not expected it, which meant I did not have a prepared answer, which meant what came out was simply true. Because it would have been wrong, I said, and I've spent enough of my life being small and quiet and safe, while wrong things happened around me. I decided I was tired of it. He looked at me for a long moment. The afternoon light had shifted while we'd been talking, moved across the floor toward the far wall, and the room was warmer now than it had been. You are not what I expected, he said, when I turned around and saw you standing there in the courtyard. You expected a maid, I said. I expected someone frightened enough to be easy to dismiss. I was frightened, I said. I know, he said. That's the part that wasn't what I expected. I did not know what to say to that. So I said nothing, and he didn't fill the silence either. And for a moment we simply existed in the same room in the afternoon light, which was not a thing that had any precedent in my experience of this castle or this life. He told me before I left that he would be departing for Elnath in 2 days, that the journey would take 5 days each way, and the negotiations at the border another week beyond that. That when he returned, he intended to make certain adjustments to the household arrangement. He did not specify what adjustments. I did not ask. I walked back to the east wing through corridors I had walked 1,000 times before, and they looked somehow very slightly different than they had before. Not the walls or the floors or the angles of the light through the high windows. Something in the way I moved through them, as if the space I occupied in this place had, without my having done anything deliberate to cause it, quietly expanded. I went back to the linen cupboard. I finished my work. I did not tell Nora anything. But that night, lying on my cot with the sound of the wind against the stones, I did not feel the walls pressing in the way they usually did. I felt instead something I had not felt in a very long time and did not quite have words for yet. Like the beginning of something. He left for Elnath on a Tuesday morning, and I watched from the east wing window the way I had watched 100 departures from that window, at a slight angle, half hidden behind the curtain, the particular posture of someone who has learned that watching openly invites questions. The carriage moved through the main gate with 4 outriders and a guard rotation I did not recognize from before, which meant they were exactly who Cassian had said they would be. Perrin sat on the coachman's bench with the solid, unhurried presence of a man who had spent 11 years in service to this household, and had no reason to be anywhere else. I watched until the carriage disappeared past the outer wall, and the gate closed behind it, and then I let the curtain fall back into place and turned to the room that needed its linen changed. Life in the castle settled into the particular quality of quiet that descends when the person at the center of things is absent. Not empty, exactly. The castle was never empty, with its 100 moving parts and the diplomatic visitors still coming and going in preparation for the Elnath agreement, but different. As if the building exhaled. I noticed things I had been too preoccupied to notice before. Nora, for instance, watching me with a new and careful attention that she was not quite skilled enough to conceal. The way the steward, a different one now, a careful, thin-shouldered man named Aldous who had been brought in from the southern household, looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Not suspicion, something closer to assessment. On the 3rd day of Cassian's absence, I was summoned to Aldous' office. I went with the same composure I had brought to the king's study, which is to say the composure of a person who has decided that if something is going to happen, there is very little use in beginning to fall apart before it does. Aldous was a precise man. His desk was the opposite of Cassian's. Nothing on it that was not necessary, everything at a right angle to everything else. He had the kind of face that gave very little away, which I had initially read as coldness, and was beginning to reread as a different kind of careful. "You've been assigned to a new position," he said, without preamble. I waited. "Effective immediately, you'll be overseeing the guest chambers in the north corridor rather than the east wing." He paused, straightening a document that was already straight. "The role carries additional responsibilities. You'll be managing the other attendants assigned to those rooms, coordinating with the kitchens for the visiting dignitaries, and attending the evening arrangements when guests require it." I looked at him for a moment. "That's not a chambermaid's position." "No," he said. "It isn't." Another pause. Outside his window, 2 castle pigeons were conducting an argument on the ledge with the passionate focus of creatures who had nothing else requiring their attention. "Did the king arrange this before he left?" I asked. Aldous allowed himself a very small expression that might, in a different face, have been a smile. "His Majesty left a number of instructions before departing," he said. "This was among them." I nodded. I said I understood. I thanked him with the measured courtesy of someone who is processing something much larger than she is letting on, and I walked out of his office and down the corridor, and into the narrow alcove beside the linen storage room where I had cried exactly twice before in 3 years, and I stood there in the dim and breathed and did not cry, though it was a near thing. Not from sadness, from something that didn't have a simple name. The particular vertigo of a life shifting under your feet in a direction you had not allowed yourself to expect. The North Corridor was a different world. I had worked in proximity to dignity before, but never in management of it. And there was a significant gap between those 2 things that I discovered rapidly in my first week. The guest chambers housed, variously, Lord Seren of the Eastern Provinces, a heavy-set man of 60, whose primary emotional register was impatience. His secretary, a young man named Davi who compensated for his employer's impatience by being relentlessly apologetic on his behalf. Lady Vereth of the coastal territories, traveling without a husband, and with the self-contained confidence of a woman who had never required one. And 2 junior diplomats from Elnath itself, brothers named Kale and Finn, who were either arguing with each other or laughing with each other and seemed incapable of any middle register. I managed them, which is to say I managed the spaces they moved through, the needs they expressed, and the ones they didn't. The particular friction points that emerged when disparate personalities were placed in proximity to each other under the pressure of negotiation. What I discovered was that I was surprisingly good at it, not in the ways I would have predicted. I had no talent for flattery and no instinct for the kind of smooth social performance that the position seemed to require on paper. What I had instead was the habit of noticing, the skill I had built over years of invisibility, now suddenly relevant. I noticed that Lord Saren's impatience peaked in the late afternoon and could be forestalled by ensuring his tea arrived 20 minutes earlier than scheduled. I noticed that Lady Vereth's self-containment was not coldness, but privacy, and that she relaxed visibly when I stopped treating her as a fragile thing that needed constant attending and simply ensured her room was exactly as she had specified and otherwise left her alone. I noticed that Kale, the elder of the Elnath brothers, was homesick in a way he was covering with noise, and that a small pot of the particular herb tea that grew in the eastern gardens, close enough to what apparently grew near the Elnath border, made him quiet in a grateful way instead of a restless one. Nora found me in the supply room on the 6th evening, ostensibly helping me count the linens for the week ahead. "You're different," she said, not accusatory, observational, in the way that was her particular gift. "I have a different job," I said. "That's not what I mean." She folded a sheet with the efficiency of long practice. "You've been different since before the job changed. Since the morning the King's journey was postponed." I handed her another sheet. "Things change. Emma," she said my name with the gentle weight of someone who has known you long enough to have earned a certain directness. "Half the castle thinks you reported the coachman for some kind of misconduct. The other half thinks you—" She stopped. "Thinks I what?" She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Thinks there must be some other reason the king would rearrange the household before he'd been gone 3 days. The supply room was very quiet. I looked at the stack of linens in my hands, and then I looked at Nora, who had been the closest thing I had to a friend in this castle for 2 years, and I made a decision about honesty. "I told him the carriage wasn't safe," I said. "That's all." "That's all," Nora repeated, in a tone that did not entirely believe me, but was choosing not to press. "That's all that happened," I said, which was true. What I did not say, and what I was still working out how to think about, was what had not happened. The conversation in the study, the afternoon light moving across the floor, the particular quality of the quiet between us that I was not ready to name and not sure I should. Nora nodded slowly, folding the last sheet with great care. "He comes back in 8 days, she said, as if mentioning the weather. "I know," I said. The 8 days were not uneventful. On the 5th day, Lord Saren's secretary came to me at the early hour, with the slightly frantic energy of someone who had been awake all night, managing something he didn't know how to manage alone. Lord Saren had received a private communication the previous evening that had deeply unsettled him, and he had spent the subsequent hours in a state of agitation that Davy described, in increasingly fragmented terms, as concerning. I followed Davy to the sitting room adjacent to Lord Saren's chambers, where I found the lord in question standing at the window with the rigid posture of a man holding himself together by force of will. He was 60 and heavyset, and had, in the previous days, given me no particular reason to feel warmly toward him. He had been sharp-tongued with Davi and dismissive of Lady Vereth, and had on 2 occasions addressed me as girl, in a way that made clear he was not using it as a term of endearment. But he was also, in this moment, visibly frightened. I sent Davi to the kitchen for tea. I asked Lord Saren if he would prefer to sit, which he did. with the slightly surprised expression of a man who expected to be left alone with his distress. I did not ask what was in the letter. I did not offer comfort of the hollow, performative variety. I simply sat in the chair across from him and waited, the way you wait for someone who needs to find their own way to a thing. It took a while. But eventually, staring into the middle distance, he said, "There are people who would prefer the Elnath negotiation to fail. I received confirmation last night that I am considered an obstacle to that failure." I thought about a rope and a weighted cloth in a darkened corridor. "Yes," I said, "I know." He looked at me then, really looked, for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived, seeing me not as staff, not as furniture, but as whatever I actually was. "The king should be informed," he said. "I'll send word through Aldous," I said. "Today." He nodded, and some of the rigidity went out of his shoulders, and I understood that what he had needed was not comfort, but competence. Someone who would not panic and would take the necessary action without requiring him to manage them through it. When Davy returned with the tea, I left them and went directly to Aldous' office and told him what I knew. He listened without interruption, asked 3 precise questions, and told me a message would go out to the king's party before the evening. I walked back to the north corridor and stood for a moment in the hallway outside the guest rooms, listening to the familiar sounds of the castle settling around me, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the pigeons on the ledge, the wind against the high windows. 3 weeks ago, I had been a chambermaid who changed linens and refilled lamps and was very good at being invisible. I was still not entirely sure what I was now, but I was beginning to suspect it was something that couldn't go back to fitting in the same small shape it had occupied before. In 7 days, the king would return from Elnath. I had a great deal to do before then, and for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I was not afraid of what came next. I was, cautiously and carefully, and with full awareness of how unfamiliar the sensation was, something approaching ready. He returned on a Wednesday. I knew before I saw the carriage because I felt the castle change, a shift in the way people moved through the corridors, a quickening in the pace of the kitchen staff, the sound of the main gate opening with the particular weight of ceremony rather than routine. I was in the north corridor adjusting the arrangement of the sitting room for an afternoon meeting between Lord Seren and Lady Vareth when I heard it, and I straightened the last candlestick on the mantel and told myself that the fact of his return was simply a logistical event in a sequence of logistical events, and that I should continue doing my work. I continued doing my work. I did not go to the courtyard window. I heard about the return through Davy, who had gone to the courtyard window, and who reported in the breathless way of someone who did not understand that he was reporting anything significant, that the king had arrived, that the negotiations in Elnath had apparently concluded successfully, and that Cassian Drell had stepped out of the carriage looking, in Davy's precise words, as if the journey had agreed with him, or perhaps as if he'd won something. I nodded and thanked him, and went to supervise the preparation of Lord Seren's afternoon tea. The summons came 2 hours later. Not a page this time. Aldous himself, appearing at the door of the north corridor sitting room with the careful bearing of a man who was not quite sure how to categorize the errand he was running. "His Majesty has asked to see you," he said. "Now, when your current duties allow," Aldous said, which both of us understood to mean now. The North Tower study looked the same as it had 3 weeks ago. The same books with their creased spines, the same maps with their marginal notes, the same window looking toward the gray suggestion of mountains in the distance. But the room felt different with Cassian in it than it had in the memory I had been carefully not examining for 3 weeks. Fuller, somehow. More itself. He looked different, too, in the small ways that travel changes people. A residual alertness in his posture, something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of negotiations concluded and problems resolved, and the particular exhaustion of having been responsible, without pause, for something large and consequential. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes that might have been tiredness, or might have been the outdoor light of the border provinces. He was standing at the map table when I came in, and he looked up, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "The negotiations went well," I said, "because someone had to say something, and it seemed like neutral ground." "They did," he said. Lord Seren's information was useful. His warning about the opposition faction allowed us to anticipate 2 moves that would otherwise have delayed us significantly. He paused. "Aldous told me how you handled that situation." "Lord Seren handled it," I said. "He made the right decision to report it. I simply made it easy for him to do so." Cassian looked at me with the expression I was beginning to recognize. The one that was not quite amusement, but lived in the same neighborhood. "You have a talent for describing your own actions in the smallest possible terms." "I'm accurate," I said. "You're modest," he said, "which is not the same thing." He moved from the map table to his desk and sat, and gestured toward the chair across from it. And I sat because I had done it once before, and the repetition made it slightly less strange. Outside, the afternoon had committed itself to a pale, clear cold, the kind of autumn day that couldn't decide if it was beautiful or bleak, and had settled on being both simultaneously. "I want to talk to you about the household arrangement," he said. I kept my expression carefully neutral. "Aldous has been very clear about the new responsibilities. I've been trying to—" "That's not what I mean," Cassian said. He rested his hands flat on the desk again, that same gesture I had noticed before, the one that had nothing courtly in it. "I mean, I want to talk to you about why I made that arrangement." I waited. "When I left for Elnath," he said, "I gave Aldous 3 sets of instructions. The first 2 were logistical, staffing the guard rotation, managing the diplomatic correspondence. The third was about you." He looked at the surface of the desk for a moment, then back up. "I want you to understand that I did not do it as a reward, or as a transaction. I did it because in 34 years I have encountered very few people who notice what you notice, who act the way you acted, and who then describe what they did as simply doing what was right." The study was very quiet. I was aware of my own breathing in a way I normally wasn't. "You should not have been a chambermaid," he said. It was not an apology, and it was not a compliment. It was simply a statement of something he had apparently decided was true. "You should have been something else for years now. That isn't something I can fix retroactively, but I can fix what comes next." I looked at him across the desk and sorted through the things I might say and discarded most of them. "What does comes next look like?" I asked. "That depends partly on you," he said. "I'm establishing a formal role, an advisor position attached to the Household Coordination Office. It would involve what you've been doing in the North Corridor, expanded, managing the diplomatic arrangements, coordinating with visiting households, identifying problems before they become crises." A brief pause. "The kind of noticing you do, made official." I turned it over in my mind. It was a significant thing, a visible thing, the opposite of invisible. "People will wonder how a former chambermaid came to hold such a position," I said. "People wonder about everything," he said. "That has never historically been a reason not to do what makes sense." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite humor, but something warmer than the careful gravity he had been maintaining. "Though I'll admit there will be those in the council who will find it inconvenient. Given that some members of that council are currently enjoying their early retirement, I find I have limited patience for inconvenience from that quarter." Despite everything I was holding carefully in place, something in me eased slightly at that. "And the ones who aren't retired are learning," he said, "to adjust their expectations of what kinds of people hold what kinds of positions in this household." I was quiet for a moment, looking at the window and the pale, cold afternoon beyond it. I was 25 years old and had spent 3 years making myself small in rooms like this one, and the fact of sitting here, being asked rather than told, being treated as someone whose consideration of a thing mattered to the outcome. It was not a small thing to absorb. "I'll take the position," I said. He nodded, once, without the performance of surprise or satisfaction, as if he had simply been waiting for me to reach the conclusion on my own time, and had been patient enough to let me. "There's one other thing," he said. I looked at him. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing words with particular care. In Elnath, during the negotiations, there were 2 evenings where the formal proceedings were suspended. Dinners, essentially. Less structured, more conversational. The Elnath representatives are not people who trust easily, and the formal sessions had been going in circles. He paused. I found myself thinking, during those dinners, about the conversation we had in this room before I left, about the way you described why you came to me in the courtyard. He looked at me steadily. "I thought that you would have handled those dinners better than anyone in my diplomatic party did." I didn't know what to do with that, so I held it carefully and said, "Did the dinners go badly?" "They went adequately," he said, which from a man of his precision told me they had gone less well than he'd wanted. The agreement was reached, but adequately is not the same as well. "And you think I could have done better?" "I think," he said slowly, "that you understand something about people, about what they need in order to trust, in order to commit, in order to stop performing and actually decide. That is rarer than most skills I can name, and more valuable than most." He was looking at me directly, without the social hedging that people usually employed when saying things that might be taken as either compliment or expectation. I think it is something this household has needed for a long time, and has not had. I was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the pale afternoon had deepened slightly toward the first suggestion of evening, the light going amber at the edges of the clouds over the mountains. "You're describing something larger than a household coordination role," I said. "Yes," he said, "I am." The frankness of it landed without fanfare, simply a truth placed in the space between us. I understood that he was not making a declaration of any single thing. He was describing a direction, the way you describe the heading of a journey without yet being able to name every road between here and there. I understood also that this was the kind of conversation that would need time. More time than an afternoon in a study with the light going amber outside. There were things between us that had no name yet, and I had learned enough in 25 years to know that unnamed things needed to remain unnamed until they were ready, and that rushing them produced something brittle that broke at the first wait. "I'll need to understand the full scope of what you're proposing," I said. "Not in principle, in practice." "Of course," he said, "and I'll need it to be clear, to Aldous, to the council, to whoever else needs to understand it, that the position is what it is, because of what the position requires, not as a gesture." "It will be clear," he said. "That was always my intention." I nodded. There was more that I might have said, and some of it was true, and some of it was too new to be said aloud yet, so I said none of it. "Thank you," I said instead, and stood. He stood as well, because that was the kind of man he was. The kind who stood when someone left the room, regardless of who they were, or what they did. "Emma," he said, as I reached the door, the same way he had said it in the courtyard, except that this time I turned. He looked at me for a moment across the study, in the amber-edged afternoon light, with an expression I did not yet have the vocabulary for. "I'm glad you spoke in the courtyard," he said. "So am I said, and meant it in more ways than I was prepared to count. Winter came to Varenmore the way it always did. Not dramatically, not with a single decisive storm, but gradually, the cold deepening by degrees, until one morning you looked out the window and understood that the world had committed itself to a different season without asking your permission. I noticed the change from a different window than the one I had spent 3 years looking through. My new rooms were on the second floor of the north wing, adjacent to the coordination office that Aldous had helped establish with characteristic precision over the course of 2 weeks. They were not large rooms, but they were mine in a way the servants' quarters had never quite been. A space I had been given not to sleep in between duties, but to actually inhabit. There was a desk by the window, and I had put books on the shelf above it, and in the morning when the light came through at the particular angle that the north wing got in winter, falling pale and clear across the desk's surface, I sometimes sat for a few minutes before the day began and simply existed in the quiet of it. It was, I was learning, possible to inhabit your own life, rather than simply endure it. This was not a small discovery. The weeks that followed Cassian's return from Elnath were full ones. The diplomatic work expanded quickly once it became clear, to Lord Seren, to Lady Vareth, to the Elnath brothers still finishing their extended stay, that I was the person to bring things to. Not because I had been formally announced as such in any grand way, but because the information moved through the castle's social fabric, the way information always does in enclosed communities. By observation, by the small evidence of who was effective and who was not, by the gradually building consensus of people who needed things done and noticed who did them. Kale, the homesick elder brother from Elnath, stopped by the coordination office on his 4th to last day and stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in. "I want to say something before we leave," he said, with the slightly stiff formality of someone delivering a prepared remark. "My brother and I came here expecting—" He paused, rearranging. "We came with a certain set of expectations about how we would be received, as junior representatives from a territory that has historically been treated as secondary." He looked at me directly. "You did not treat us as secondary." "You weren't," I said. "Many people in this castle believed otherwise," he said. "You were not one of them. That mattered. It mattered to the negotiations, I think, more than anyone will formally acknowledge." He gave a slight, precise nod. "The herb tea also mattered." I smiled, which surprised him slightly. "I'll make sure the recipe gets written down." He laughed, an actual laugh, without the performative edge that had covered his homesickness in the first days, and left. And I turned back to the correspondence on my desk with the quiet, settled feeling of something that had been well and truly completed. Lord Seren left on a Thursday, with more warmth than he had arrived with, which was not a difficult standard to exceed, but was nonetheless genuine. He shook my hand in the entrance hall, an unusual gesture, the handshake of one professional to another, and told me in his characteristically abrupt way that he intended to recommend to his household that they establish a similar coordination role. "You've made me reconsider some assumptions," he said, which I understood to be the most significant concession he was capable of. Lady Vareth was the last to leave, delayed by a correspondence matter that required an extra 3 days. On her final evening, she came to the coordination office at the late hour, which was unusual, and sat in the chair across from my desk with the self-contained composure I had come to understand was not distance, but a chosen privacy. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Of course." "How did you know," she said, with me, what I needed? Most people in a hospitality role either hover or neglect. You did neither. You seemed to know from the first day. I thought about it honestly. "You're a person who has spent a great deal of energy managing other people's assumptions about you," I said. The most useful thing I could offer was to not be another person whose assumptions needed managing. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is either very perceptive or very lucky." "Probably some of both," I said. She smiled, one of the rare ones, the kind that changed her whole face. "You will do important things here," she said. Not a compliment exactly, more like a statement of observed fact. "I hope the people around you understand that." I thanked her, and meant it, and in the morning watched her carriage disappear through the main gate from the north wing window, and felt the particular satisfaction of having done something well from beginning to end. Cassian and I had developed, over those weeks, a pattern that had emerged without either of us designing it. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times when the diplomatic correspondence was heavy, I came to the North Tower study to review the coordination matters that required his awareness. These were working meetings, practical and focused, and in the beginning, they had been conducted with the careful formality of 2 people who understood that the nature of their professional relationship needed to be established clearly before anything else could exist alongside it. But clarity, once established, has a way of making room for other things. The meetings had gradually extended, not in their formal content, but in the quiet that came after the content was addressed. When the papers were set aside and the afternoon or evening light was doing something interesting to the room, and one of us would say something that was not about the correspondence or the diplomatic schedule, a thought, an observation, something that had been sitting at the edge of conversation waiting for space. He was, I was discovering, a person who thought carefully before he spoke, and then said exactly what he meant, a quality I found more restful than I had words for, having spent years in proximity to people who said what was expedient, and meant something adjacent to it, or nothing at all. I was discovering also that the weight he carried, the specific gravity of being responsible for Varenmore, for its relationships, for the lives that moved within its borders and beyond them, was something he bore with a particular solitude. Not loneliness exactly, or not only that. The solitude of a person who has learned that most of the people around them are responding to the position rather than the person, and who has adapted to this by compressing himself into the space that remains, which is smaller than it should be for someone of his actual size. I did not say this to him, but I thought he knew that I knew it, which was its own kind of conversation. On a Tuesday evening in the deep of winter, 3 months after his return from Elnath, we were sitting in the study after the coordination review was complete, with the fire going and the darkness pressing against the northern window, and he said, without particular preamble, "I've been thinking about the Spring Council Assembly." "The full assembly?" I asked. The full council assembled twice a year. This would be the spring session, when all regional representatives gathered at Varenmore for a week of formal proceedings. Yes. He was looking at the fire rather than at me, in the way he sometimes did when he was saying something he had thought about more than he was letting on. "I want you to be present, not as staff, as part of the formal advisory structure." I was quiet for a moment. The spring assembly was a significant thing. It was where the real governance happened, where alliances were demonstrated, where hierarchies were made visible, where the question of who sat in what room sent messages that everyone in that room was fluent in reading. "That will be noticed," I said. "Yes," he said. "It will. Some people will object." "Some people," he said, "have been objecting to things I've done since I was 22, and first took this position. I have found that the objections have very little correlation with whether the thing objected to was correct." He turned from the fire then, and looked at me with the directness I had stopped being surprised by, and started being grateful for. "You have spent 3 months making this household function better than it has in years. You have handled diplomatic relationships that my most experienced staff members were struggling with. You have identified problems and solved them before they became crises. Twice." A brief pause. "The spring assembly is where I govern. I want the people who help me govern to be visible there." I looked at him across the study, in the firelight, and thought about a courtyard in pre-dawn gray and a warning that had left my lips before I could stop it. I thought about 3 years of changed linens and refilled lamps and the careful, practiced art of being invisible. "All right," I said. Something in him settled. That same quality I had noticed in the courtyard. The change in pressure that was barely visible but palpable if you were paying attention. "There's something else," he said. I waited. He looked at the fire again for a moment, and then back at me, and his expression had shifted into the territory of something I had been aware of for weeks, and had been, with great discipline, choosing not to examine too directly. "I am aware," he said carefully, "that there are things between us that exist outside the professional arrangement, that have existed there for some time." He paused. "I have not said anything because I did not want to complicate something that needed to be established on its own terms first. The role needed to be real before anything else could be real alongside it." "Yes," I said, because it was true, and because I had understood this, and because I had been waiting, with a patience that surprised me, for him to understand it too. "But the role is real now," he said. "It is," I said. He was quiet for a long moment, and the fire settled in the grate. And outside, the winter dark pressed its full weight against the window, and inside the study the warmth held. "I would like," he said, with the precision of a man who does not use words carelessly, "to know you better. Outside of the correspondence reviews and the diplomatic schedules, as people know each other." He looked at me steadily. "If that is something you would want." I thought about the question honestly, which it deserved. I thought about who I had been 3 months ago, and who I was now, and how much of the distance between those two people had been crossed alone, in the small hours, in the process of deciding what I was willing to want. "It is," I said. The simplicity of it seemed to mean something to him. He nodded once, and the careful gravity that was his habitual expression shifted slightly, not into anything performative, just into something a degree warmer, a degree less armored. We sat in the study for another hour, talking about things that had nothing to do with correspondence or diplomacy, about the mountains visible from his window, which he had never traveled to despite years of looking at them, about the southern household where I had worked before Varenmore, and what it had been like to arrive here with a canvas bag and a letter and the intention of becoming invisible, about the particular quality of winter silence in a stone building, which was different from any other kind of silence. It was the kind of conversation that does not announce itself as significant while it is happening. You only know afterward, when you are carrying it home through quiet corridors, that something was decided in it, not dramatically, not with gestures or declarations, but in the way that most real things are decided, through the slow accumulation of honest moments. The spring assembly came, and I sat in rooms I had never sat in, seen by people who looked at me with curiosity, and in some cases with the particular resentment of those who find that the world has arranged itself differently than they planned. I did my work. I did it well, and visibly, which was the only answer to resentment that has ever mattered. Lady Verith, who attended as a regional representative, found me on the second day and said simply, "Good," with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions have been confirmed. Lord Seren shook my hand again, more briefly this time, and introduced me to the northern representative with a description that made me sound considerably more formidable than I felt, which I understood to be his particular form of endorsement. Cale had written a letter that arrived 2 weeks before the assembly, from Elnath, with the herb tea recipe's regional equivalent enclosed, and a note that said only, "We hope Varenmore continues to be governed by people who understand what governing actually requires. We believe it is." I kept the letter. It lived on my desk beside the books I had put on the shelf in the room I had made mine. What I know now, that I did not know in a gray pre-dawn courtyard with my heart hammering and my hands not quite steady, is this. The moment I spoke was not the beginning of a story. It was the culmination of everything I had been, quietly and without recognition, for years. The noticing, the piecing together, the small, unheralded courage of a person who has decided that being invisible is no longer enough. The warning I gave was real. The danger was real. The rope and the weighted cloth and the loose spoke on the rear left wheel. Those were real, and they mattered. And the fact that they were prevented from mattering in the worst way is something I carry with a quiet, steady weight. But what I also carry, what turned out to be the larger story, was not the warning itself. It was what the warning revealed about who I was capable of being when I stopped making myself small enough to fit in spaces that had never been built for me. Cassian asked me once, much later, what I had been thinking in the courtyard in the moments before I spoke. What had finally made me step forward. I told him the truth, that I had not been thinking. That I had simply been tired. Tired of watching, tired of knowing, tired of carrying things in silence that deserved to be said aloud. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm glad you were tired." "So am I," said. And this time, when I meant it in more ways than I could count, I counted them anyway. Every single one.